Hey Radicals, welcome to the 6th annual Primo Radical Clip Show. As longtime listeners know, every year on the birthday of this show, we do a retrospective clip show. Sometimes we do themed clip shows like we did in 2019 doing a retrospective of Russiagate. And this year I thought it might be fun to look back at the most controversial episodes in Primo Radical history. Now, before we get started, there's a few things that new listeners and viewers should know. One is that the original name that I went by was Primo Nutmeg. That's a reference to my home state of Connecticut being the Nutmeg State. This past spring, I rebranded as Primo Radical. But on today's clip show, we're going to look back at a lot of Primo Nutmeg content. Number 2 is that I didn't start doing video chat interviews until about 2019. Prior to that, I either did in-person interviews or phone interviews. As such, many of the first few interviews that we're going to see here were telephone interviews. The sound quality is not great, and early on I did just set the audio to still images instead of slideshows. So the first few interviews may not be that visually appealing on YouTube, but I promise you they are great content, so please do listen. And number 3 is that originally I did not just interview political figures. Over the past several years, I've been more exclusively focusing on journalists and politicians and activists. But in the first few years of this show, I did interview other kinds of guests: professional wrestlers, UFC fighters, musicians, actors, comic book writers and artists, and many others. And that actually brings me to another topic that I'd like your feedback on. Truth be told, occasionally I do want to interview folks who are not political, either musicians who I look up to, or comic book writers or artists, or professional wrestlers, or actors. So what I'd like to know from YouTube viewers is, would you like that content on this channel? Or do you think I should start a separate channel where I focus more on pop culture? Basically what I'm asking is, do you mind if that content is mixed in here? Do you think that it's confusing? Would you prefer not to hear from non-political guests on this channel? Or alternatively, are you open to hearing non-political interviews on this channel? Please let me know in the comments below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look back at the most controversial episodes in Primo Radical history. First up, from November 2016, is episode number 53 with Jake the Snake Roberts. Now, as many of you know, Jake the Snake Roberts is one of the most famous professional wrestlers in history. He made a name for himself in the World Wrestling Federation in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And during his appearance on my show, he revealed that another professional wrestler known as the Honky Tonk Man was allegedly purchasing other wrestlers' trademarks out from under them. This interview caused a lot of controversy. It was picked up by multiple websites. It also caused the Honky Tonk Man to lash out at Jake the Snake Roberts on Twitter, referencing Roberts' drug and alcohol problems in the past. And it also caused Honky Tonk Man to block me on Twitter, which I thought was pretty funny. Anyway, let's take a trip back to November 2016 to hear this clip with Jake the Snake Roberts.
You know, working with the Honky Tonk Man at the time was okay, but since then he's become a real piece of shit. You know, this guy is out stealing. Well, he's stealing people's names. You know, he's trying to buy, get the names and own them, and then whenever you try to use your own name, you have to pay him. Seriously. Yeah. Well, he's tried it with too many people now. You know, he's got a few names under his belt. He took there was a masked guy, the Patriot. He owns that name. You know, what really? He went to the trademark registration people, see. And, if you let it run out, then somebody else can buy it, for $3.50 or whatever. And so now any money that's made by the Patriot, the money goes to him.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Well, he tried that with my name. Can you believe that? Yeah.
Yeah,
he's got one. Yeah, that scumbag piece of shit. Yeah, he also bought Jim Duggan. He also got Jim Duggan's name. I hate to be the Honky Tonk Man when Jim Duggan gets hold of his ass. That will not be pretty. And I just ran into him the other day, and all I did was look at him, and the guy has no balls. He simply just ducked his head and held his head down, man, and just sucked up to some girl that was working for him there at the con. I'd seen him in the past dress his son up with a mask and call him the Patriot and cheat the fans out of money, selling them bogus Patriot stuff. And, come on, man. What are you, And, I guess that's what drunks do. I used to be a drunk. I did some dumb shit, but I never did shit that dumb.
Next up, let's take a trip back to February of 2017. This is episode number 66 with actor Jason David Frank. As many of you, I'm sure, are familiar, Jason David Frank played Tommy, the Green Ranger, and the White Ranger on the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. This actually was part of a series where I interviewed 4 of the surviving 5 original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers on the show. What was controversial about this appearance, however, was not what Jason had to say about anything having to do with the show, but actually that Jason was challenging former UFC fighter and once again professional wrestler CM Punk to a mixed martial arts bout. This story was picked up by a bunch of tabloids. A lot of people found it interesting at the time. So let's take a look back at this clip from episode number 66.
If Punk fights again, everybody at the banks, everybody that owns UFC wants me to fight him. So,
absolutely,
if he fights again, that's definitely something I would like to do. And man, I got a chance to visit, some of the WWE guys on their shows and seeing backstage. It's much like, UFC. I'm not talking about the fighting, but, the energy everyone puts into the show. So one way or another, I'd love to either get involved with WWE or UFC just to please the fans. For me, I've been fighting my whole entire life. I can do it tomorrow if I want. I love it. It just has to make sense why we're doing it.
Right.
And it has to, and what I mean by makes sense is not a financial sense, because I'd fight CM Punk for $1. I would do, a Power Ranger movie for nothing. I'm not financially hurt. What I'm saying is if it makes sense for my fan base. Do my fans say, yes, that's what I want to see him? Yes, I like to see him in Bloodshot. Oh, I don't like that terrible he did. So I always like going back to the fans thinking, is this something they want? Because if it is, I'll do it. And it's not about money at all. And that's what I mean about making sense. For CM Punk, for him, it makes sense on a financial level, but I'm super different than most of these people out there. And that's the truth. Like, I don't care about the money. That's what I said from day one. I would fight him for $1 just to make the contract legal. And I think that installs so much confidence in me that's what scares him, is like, why does this guy want to fight me for $1? I'm going to get my butt kicked. And that's kind of what happened, to be honest.
Is there any specific reason that you challenged him in particular?
No, not at all. I thought the fan base was great. I never thought he would fight in the UFC. I got a deal a long time ago with me and him on an NBC show. My manager was pushing every show here at Legacy, wanted to fight Punk on Legacy, and Mick actually is the matchmaker now for UFC. So everybody wanted to see this fight, and I picked him because I like the guy. I picked him because I said, man, he's got a huge fan base, and he wants to fight. I don't want to pick a guy who doesn't want to fight and convince them he wants to fight. So I said, hey, that's perfect. Perfect. He's 38. I don't care. I'm 43. It's like, who cares? If he sits there and calls me an old man, well, you're getting old too, buddy. So, I never thought he would be in the UFC, because the UFC strives for perfection. Like, there's so many people that fight to get into the UFC. Out of like 600 UFC fighters, CM Punk is listed at like 170 top paid UFC fighter with only one fight. Now you got, 3, 4, 5, 600 people that are struggling, that are really good fighters that, could use the money or earn the money. And so I was just thinking, fan base loves it. All these things started coming out, and then I talked to him about it, and then he's like, yeah. And then he started saying he's a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, and then I started believing him, and then all this stuff started coming out, thinking, I don't know if he's just saying that to impress me at the time, or he actually never thought this could possibly ever happen with us. And it was very possible. But I like the guy. I like CM Punk. I just like to show the world who is the best in the world, and that's why me and him should fight, to say who is best in the world, to own that slogan. I know WWE owns it, but I'm just saying.
Well, I agree with you. As a UFC fan, I would love to see that fight. I know CM Punk is looking for another fight, so I think that would be a real big moneymaker. I know that a lot of people would love to see it, so hopefully that does happen. Yeah. And, as a WWE fan as well, I would love to see you in there. Is there anybody in WWE that you would like to work with in particular?
Oh, man, I love, like, everybody in there. I work on so many shows with these guys. I've done so many Comic-Cons, and I got to tell you, man, they treated me so great at the Royal Rumble. I talked to all of them, and I think that world's a little different. I don't think it's like a challenge thing. I think just be a part of the WWE and then seeing where that goes from there. But, Sheamus took his time out talking to me, like, Bella Twins, everybody just, they're over there. And the cool thing is that it's endless with what you do over there. I, saw, Creed and a bunch of other people that were over there that were really nice to me, and they were big fans as well. So in the UFC world, back up a little bit, is that I think everyone strives to be in this UFC, and to get there with no fights, no fight experience, and a real high-paid fighter more than anyone made a lot of people upset, and I think that's why he got so much hatred from it. Now, if he pulled a hell of a fight off, be worth the money, it would be great. But it was all hype, and I got to say, I did a lot of that hyping for him. It was me and him. I was calling Fox Sports. Joe Silva, the matchmaker, said it could possibly happen. My manager, even Dana White, told some of my friends this is why. So I pushed it really hard, thinking I was going to get it, and I didn't. And some people are like, "Oh, whatever they say." It just was a fun thing to bring those universes together.
Noam Chomsky has been on the show on 3 occasions, first on episode number 24 back in 2016. On Chomsky's second and third appearances on this show, which took place in July 2018 and March 2019 respectively, I asked Noam Chomsky about Russiagate and accusations that US President Donald Trump was supposedly colluding with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Both of these next 2 clips caused a lot of controversy, especially among supporters of the Russiagate conspiracy theory. So let's take a look back to see what was so controversial. These are clips from episodes number 144 in July 2018 and episode 169 from March 2019. Thank you again for meeting with me. I really do appreciate it. It's always an honor to speak with one of the greatest thinkers of the modern era, so I sincerely do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
It's likely that the key story that will define the Trump presidency is the so-called Russiagate accusations. I know that you previously stated that these claims were something of a joke and that Trump himself is largely a distraction. But could you please clarify if you think Russia did anything devious, if leaking the DNC emails are really even a crime, or if you believe Russia did collude with Trump but that the story has been manipulated by the mainstream media to create sort of a neo-McCarthyist Red Scare?
I presume that Russia had an interest in the outcome of the election and probably tried to influence it. I don't consider that a major issue. For one thing, if you want to consider interventions in the elections, there are vastly greater ones. So, for example, it's well established by very solid empirical work by academic political scientists. Thomas Ferguson is the major one, that American elections are, in a certain sense, bought, in the sense that you can predict the outcome of an election with extreme precision simply by looking at the single variable of campaign funding. And in fact, Ferguson did a very close, careful analysis of the 2016 election, which verified this hypothesis in a way that most people aren't aware of. He looked closely at the way campaign funding worked, and it turned out in the last stages of the campaign, when the big investors and capitalist interests were beginning to be afraid that they didn't like Trump, but they were afraid that there might be a moderately liberal Democrat. They poured money in a very targeted way, not just to the presidents, but to the Senate and House elections, and that led to a change which is reflected in the vote. So that's real manipulation of elections, massive manipulation. If the Russians did something minor, maybe. Furthermore, manipulation of elections by external powers is pretty normal. The United States, in fact, is the champion in that regard. We not only intervene in elections, we overthrow governments if we don't like them, things like that. In fact, if you want to look at manipulation of elections recently, the most striking example, which to my knowledge has only been reported in the business press, Bloomberg Business Week, is the last German elections a couple months ago. There was a very surprise, everyone was surprised by the rise in votes gained by the more or less neo-fascist party, Alternative for Deutschland. Turns out that there was a campaign organized by a Texas media company that works for Trump, Le Pen, Netanyahu, others. They collaborated with the Berlin Facebook office, which provided them with a detailed demographic analysis of voters in Germany, and they were able to micro-target election-based ads to these individuals in a way which seems to have had a fairly significant influence on the rise of the neo-fascist party. That's a detectable case. Others may exist or may not, but they're all pretty, in fact, the U.S. not only intervenes, but in elections, let's say in Russia, for example, but is very proud of it. So Clinton massively intervened in the, I think it was 1996 elections, in which Yeltsin, his favorite, was elected, and it was considered a great triumph. It wasn't hidden. So maybe the Russians tried to do something. There's no indication that it had much effect, but it doesn't seem to me a significant issue. I think it's picked up by the Democrats and by the liberal press because they hate Trump, of course, and are trying to find some way to undermine him. Democrats are seeking an excuse for why they lost an election, which should have been an open-shut affair if they'd ran a decent campaign and had decent programs.
Well, what's interesting is if you actually look back to the 2012 election, President Obama was very critical of Mitt Romney's position on Russia and was saying that it was a Cold War era position, and it was very critical. I believe he even said at one point the 1980s called.
Because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. But, Governor, when it comes to our foreign policy, you seem to want to import the foreign policies of the 1980s. You indicated that we shouldn't be passing nuclear treaties with Russia, despite the fact that 71 senators, Democrats and Republicans, voted for it.
The statements that Governor Romney makes show little understanding of what is actually going on in the 21st century.
This is to Russia. This is, without question, our number one geopolitical foe.
It's a really curious statement, given that the Cold War has been over for some time.
He is not up to date, and that is a very dangerous aspect. That's just an example of his 20th century approach to 21st century issues.
He's even blurted out the preposterous notion that Russia is our number one geopolitical foe. Folks, Sarah Palin said she could see Russia from Alaska. Mitt Romney talks like he's only seen Russia by watching Rocky IV. I tell you.
We have a lot of problems that are not leftovers from the past, but are of the moment. We've just been talking about one, namely Iran. And in many of the areas where we are working to solve problems, Russia has been an ally. They're in the P5+1 talks with us. They have worked with us in Afghanistan and have been very helpful in the Northern Distribution Network and in other ways. So I think it's somewhat dated to be looking backwards instead of being realistic about where we agree, where we don't agree, but looking for ways to bridge the disagreements and then to maximize the cooperation.
What do you think it was that caused the Democrats to suddenly become such hawks against Russia? Was it what happened with Ukraine, or was there something maybe else that has caused this new wave again of, it seems like a second Cold War almost?
Well, the roots are pretty deep. It's you have to look back to the collapse of the Soviet system if we want to understand what's happening. In around 1990, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. The question is what's going to happen next? And there were two quite different visions. Mikhail Gorbachev, the speaking for the former Soviet Union, advanced the idea of what he called a common European home. There should be a single, broader European home, including Western Europe, including Russia, eliminate all military alliances, have a common security system, and work towards a common integrated future. The U.S. wasn't having any of that. George Bush, the first, and his Secretary of State, James Baker, had their proposal, what they wanted, and what Gorbachev agreed to, was a unified Germany that would become part of NATO. And for Gorbachev to agree with that is a pretty substantial concession. After all, Russia had practically been destroyed twice in the century by Germany alone. Germany as part of a hostile military alliance is a little bit frightening from a Russian point of view, but he agreed. And there was a quid pro quo. The quid pro quo was that NATO would not move, the phrase was, 1 inch to the east. By that they meant East Berlin, East Germany. Nobody was talking about anything beyond. That was never in writing, and it was a gentleman's agreement. And when the U.S. very quickly moved NATO into East Germany, they argued, Bush and Baker argued, that there was only a verbal discussion, never an official commitment. We can debate that. But what next happened under Clinton is that NATO expanded all the way to the Russian border. And from the Russian point of view, which we should try to understand, that's the traditional invasion route through which Russia has been repeatedly invaded and virtually destroyed. Now all part of a hostile military alliance. The U.S. went on, including under Obama, to place George Bush II had withdrawn from the anti-ballistic ABM treaty, ballistic missile treaty. It's well understood that missile defense, what's called missile defense, is in effect a first strike weapon. And nobody believes that any conceivable missile defense would ever stop a first strike. Conceivably, it might stop a retaliatory strike, which makes it, in effect, a first strike weapon. And these are being placed right near the Russian border. They also have, the claim is their defense against Iran, but it's not even laughable. Right. It was pointed out right at the time, the beginning of the expansion, by George Kennan and other statesmen, that expanding to the Russian border was an error of a tragic error of historical significance. It virtually guaranteed tension and conflict at the border, which is extremely dangerous. And of course that's taken place. Meanwhile, the Russian economy was subjected to rapid marketization, shock therapy it was called, which devastated the economy in the 90s. The economy just almost total collapsed. Millions of people died. It was a monstrosity from the point of view of the Russian population. And there was a reaction. Putin came in and restored a kind of nationalist effort to restore Russia's place in the world, its power, and rebuild its economy, and so on. All of this led to an inevitable conflict. The Obama administration at first tried to, what they called, reset relations with Russia to be more amicable, but that broke down under disagreements over a series of issues. Ukraine, which you mentioned, was one. There were others, and policy reversed. Clinton herself was pretty much of a hawk on Russia, but now the situation's mixed. There's interactions on Syria, there's threatening conflicts, and there is what's often called a new Cold War.
What are your overall thoughts on how the media has reported on quote-unquote Russiagate, the accusation that Russia has interfered in the 2016 election and might interfere in the 2020 election?
I think it's so farcical that I barely even read the reports. It's a joke. I mean, if there was First of all, if there was any interference by the Russians, it's essentially undetectable. There are careful analyses of what happened in the elections. You can see how it changed, how the money poured in, all sorts of things. There's no sign of any Russian effect. Furthermore, it's just almost incredible from the beginning. I mean, what happened in the Senate and the House in 2016? Did the Russians interfere in the Senate elections? It went exactly the same way. Furthermore, the whole thing is a bad joke for all sorts of reasons. And for one thing, there are countries that do interfere in American elections, openly, publicly, forcefully. One of them even sent its prime minister to address a joint session of Congress to attack the initiative being taken by the sitting president. Is that interference? That was Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's only one part of it. I mean, that's large-scale, massive interference. Any other country did that, we'd have a huge scandal. Furthermore, does the U.S. interfere in elections? In Russia, for example? Yes, and proudly. In 1996, Clinton took pride in the fact that large-scale U.S. interference in the Russian election swung it to his favorite, Boris Yeltsin. The U.S. goes way beyond interfering in elections. It overthrows governments. I don't have to go through the history. So talk about Russian interference is simply a joke. Furthermore, the whole discussion is completely beside the point. There is massive interference in U.S. elections from the U.S. corporate sector, who pretty much buy the elections. There's extensive research. Tom Ferguson's is by far the best. It's very extensive, shows very convincingly that you can predict the outcome of an American election in Congress and executive with remarkable precision simply by looking at the single variable of campaign funding. And that's just the beginning. Ferguson's analysis goes right through 2016, includes Congress. This goes back a long time. Of course, it's picked up a lot under the opening of the floodgates by the reactionary Supreme Court, but it goes back to the 19th century. Is that interference in elections? And that's the bare beginning. Since the 1970s, when the neoliberal assault began, the number of lobbyists in Congress has just skyrocketed. A normal representative in Congress may spend several hours a day just talking to donors to try to get funds for the next election so he has a chance of running. Meanwhile, the lobbyists are meeting with his staff, bringing all of their huge resources, which of course overwhelm the staff, and pretty much writing the legislation. Is that interference with elections? I mean, what's being discussed is not even a joke. I mean, the election system is deeply corrupted right at its core in many ways.
Do you believe that Donald Trump colluded with the Russian government?
I haven't the slightest idea, and I don't care.
It isn't it important, though? I mean, the corporate media.
If there's going to be collusion, I think we can guess what it is. Maybe he made some deal to have a Trump hotel put up in Moscow. Okay, that's corrupt, but it's the kind of corruption that unfortunately is all over the place.
But with a quid pro quo of the Russians helping.
Of what? The quid pro quo is that he's increased military action on the Russian border. He's created a huge military expansion of the military budget aimed at Russia. He's pulled out of the INF treaty, which is a major threat to Russia. What's the quid pro quo?
Again, it goes back to the accusation from the corporate media that Russia was, had social media trolls, that they released the emails that they possibly were working with WikiLeaks.
Yeah, but now we're back to the former question. There's no evidence of any Russian effect on the presidential election, certainly none on the Senate or House elections, which went exactly the same way, and there's no charge of Russian interference. And then the rest of the story that I just mentioned about actual interference. So it's not a serious charge. I mean, there's lots of things to condemn about Trump, but not that.
The day after that last interview was filmed, I recorded a new episode with former Congressman Ron Paul on episode number 170. As many of you know, Ron Paul is a famous Libertarian and Republican congressman. He ran for president with the Libertarian Party in 1988 and with the Republican Party in 2008 and 2012. One clip from that interview that made a lot of headlines was Ron Paul's support of Democratic candidate Tulsi Gabbard. As you can imagine, people from across the political spectrum had a lot of views on this, both positive and negative. So let's take a look back at this interview recorded in March 2019 with Ron Paul. The candidate who I find most interesting actually is Tulsi Gabbard, and she's been very vocal against what she's called the new Cold War. She's been vocal against neoconservatives and neoliberals in both parties pursuing regime change wars, often talking about the prospect of nuclear war and critical of Donald Trump for pulling out of the INF treaty. So are you familiar with Tulsi Gabbard? And if so, just what are your thoughts on her campaign?
Well, yes, I am familiar with her. I think she's great on foreign policy. And if people are wondering who to support and how to look at this, there is no doubt she's on the right track. We could say yes, keep going, and put the pressure on. But these other people, you can't trust them. Sanders or anybody else, they all have. It's all self-serving. Rubio, how can anybody trust him? He's part of the neocon crowd. He's part of the Bolton crowd and Abrams crowd. He's all that, which is just horrible. And so, the squabble that they're having with the Democrats, I just hope Tulsi keeps going. I'll bet she's going to, if she sticks with it, she'll find out there's more support for her than you'd be led to believe. I think that's what I found out in my campaigns. I thought this was an idiotic thing, is to say that, some of the things coming at us is a responsibility and a blowback from our own foreign policy. And lo and behold, there are a bunch of people out there that there's a time somebody said this. And I think that's what would happen with Tulsi. That's why we should encourage her without, being involved with our government or government policies, other than the fact that in a negative way, that is no militancy and no threats and no pretense, but to say, look, what we think we should be doing if they improve themselves, we should be talking to you. We shouldn't be putting on sanctions, and we shouldn't be dealing with all the world with threats and intimidations and freezing of assets, and then ultimately, if you don't behave, where there will be a coup. And that's what we're involved in Venezuela right now, because there would be no battle down there right now without Guaido getting support from us.
Now, shortly after that interview was recorded, I drove up to New Hampshire and filmed an interview with Tulsi Gabbard in person. That interview was also pretty controversial for many different reasons, but one reason in particular was the fact that Tulsi Gabbard came out in support of various whistleblowers, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and Chelsea Manning. So once again, let's listen to another interview from March 2019. Here's my first interview with Tulsi Gabbard. When I saw you last time, a month ago, you got a question from the audience about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and you had said that WikiLeaks had spurred some necessary change. I just was wondering if maybe you go into a little more depth in speaking about that.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and what they've done? And some feel that Julian Assange is being persecuted. Do you believe that?
Well, I think there's a few different examples of people who are whistleblowers who have brought forward information about how, for example, government agencies, intelligence agencies have overreach into our private information, this mass surveillance without a warrant, that actually violate our constitutional rights. These are things that a lot of us had no idea were happening until they were exposed. This gave us the opportunity, especially as members of Congress, to do something about it. to try to put those protections in place, to try to reform our laws that allowed for this abuse, many of which were opened up because of the Patriot Act. So, I think you're asking about Assange, but I think there are a number of other examples that need to be raised in how we provide protection for whistleblowers who are bringing forward this information that lawmakers and all of us need to be aware of in order to make that change.
Well, another example is Chelsea Manning, who just recently was jailed again. Do you think that Chelsea Manning is one of these whistleblowers who has been vindicated and that shouldn't be suffering anymore? I mean, I know President Obama gave her a pardon. What are your thoughts on her being jailed again?
Yeah, she shouldn't be. I mean, she's even though she got that pardon, they're putting her in jail for her refusal to cooperate. I think is further evidence for us to make sure that we have these protections in place so people are not wrongly incarcerated.
And similarly, the most famous whistleblower is probably Edward Snowden. And I know that he's a very controversial figure because he also showed how deeply everyone is being spied on. However, he's hiding in Russia to avoid prosecution. So just what's your stance on Edward Snowden?
Yeah, like I said, prosecution of whistleblowers who are bringing forward information about how the government is violating our constitutional rights need to have protections in place and not prosecuted and treated like criminals.
In May of 2019, I drove up to Worcester, Massachusetts to record an interview with Howie Hawkins. Hawkins was widely regarded at the time as the favorite to win the Green Party's 2020 presidential nomination. During this interview, Hawkins made a lot of comments that many people on the left took issue with. One was his embrace of Russiagate, which many found ironic, seeing as how Jill Stein had been demonized for years as being a Russian agent. Another was how Hawkins characterized Julian Assange. And remember, this was right after Julian Assange was originally arrested in April of 2019. Also controversial was Hawkins misgendering Chelsea Manning. And finally, how he characterized Tulsi Gabbard's meeting with Bashar al-Assad. So let's take a trip back to May of 2019 to relive this controversial interview with Howie Hawkins. I'd just be interested overall, what are your thoughts on the way that Jill Stein has been treated by the corporate media following the 2016 election?
Well, I was part of an advisory group to Jill, and I advised her not to go to that RT thing.
Why?
And in fact, I thought it was a setup. RT is, Russian propaganda. There's a lot of good programming on it, and they don't really interfere with that. Chris Hedges, Larry King, I don't know if Larry's still on there, Tom Hartman. But there's also, when the news comes from central headquarters, they get all kinds of crazy conspiracy people on there. All LaRouche people, the Lyndon LaRouche, right. Conspiracy people and others. So I didn't trust them. And actually another person said, they could take a picture that would just overshadow everything you say. And she thought she'd give a message. She was encouraged by a lot of people in the peace movement. So she went. And that picture, Putin, you said she sat down with Putin. No, Putin sat down at the table with her for just a few minutes.
Right.
Picture snapped. Flynn is there. She don't know Flynn. Nobody knows Flynn. And Putin leaves. And then Sputnik International, another state media, puts it out on the media. And then, what's their purpose? Divide us in this country. The liberals from the more radical elements. And then MSNBC, CNN, Fox put that picture out there, and a lot of print media, again and again and again. They're doing it for Russian propaganda. That was what the Russians wanted. I mean, it's so ironic. The media is, they're following this Russiagate thing, which I think is serious. I think Trump ought to be impeached. I think it's obvious he sought collusion. He did collude. Him and his son and his son-in-law, and, it's all over that first volume of the Mueller report. It's all over there. I mean, when people say, oh, it showed no collusion. No, it didn't. It says, Mueller says right away, I didn't talk about collusion. I talked about narrow legal definition of conspiracy. Plus, I can't indict a president, according to this OLC letter in the Justice Department. He just laid out the evidence for prosecutors, which has to be Congress. you don't have to have the quid pro quo where they got together and plotted. I think more he was played by the Russians, a useful idiot. They figured they could do more with him than they could with Clinton. So they had an interest. I think they definitely want him to elect. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. It doesn't mean they, said, let's make a deal and we'll do this if you do that. But they still, they obviously intervened. And, that's a problem. And it's a problem for a candidate to accept that.
Part of the Mueller report is suggesting that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks played a role in this. That's not what Julian Assange was just arrested for. He was arrested for the leaks that came back in 2010 or 2011 about Iraq. But I just would be interested in your take on that. Do you think that WikiLeaks was involved in this Russian plot?
I don't know if they were working for Russia. Assange was working for himself. And I have to tell you, him giving the advice to Donald Jr. that you should protest the election if you lose. I mean, he's dealing with the son of a Klansman becoming president, an out-and-out racist who is encouraging, the right wing that's armed to come out and cause mayhem. I mean, those politics are really bad. So, if he ends up going to trial, we may find out more. I don't think he should on this 2010 charge. That's a whistleblower thing. He was a publisher, and he should be defended. But his politics in 2010, trying to give advice to Donald Jr. for the campaign, working with Trump, that's bad. I don't support that at all. I wouldn't, so that'd be my criticism of Julian Assange. Now, how much he speaks for the whole WikiLeaks organization? Probably does, because one of his defenses was that was on WikiLeaks, not him personally, but pretty much everybody understands it was him. And whether that was with the Russians, that I think is not documented. There's circumstantial evidence. Like, well, where are the WikiLeaks about, Putin? That's the Panama Papers. A lot of stuff came out about Putin and his wealth there. So that remains to be seen if he was working with the Russians or just biased with them. We'll see. I'm not sure. But he should not be prosecuted for publishing the leaks from Bradley Manning, or what's he call himself? Chelsea.
In terms of 2016, though, I do have to ask, too, just because what WikiLeaks released in 2016 was emails showing that the DNC was colluding with the media and with state parties, and specifically against Bernie Sanders, and plotting against Bernie Sanders. Do you think that it is a crime to expose that?
No, not for WikiLeaks. The crime was hacking. That's a crime. Assange says he didn't get it from the Russians. The intelligence community says the Russians did it. Maybe Assange is saying he got it from a cutout. The Russians gave it to somebody who gave it to him. And he's not really lying. I think we'll find out in the end. Her meeting with Assad, I wouldn't have done that. In fact, that was another offer that Jill got, and she didn't do it.
Really?
On our advice, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
When did she get that invitation?
2015. And, to go with a delegation under control of the Assad regime is, that is for their purposes. You're not going to, particularly in the middle of the Civil War, you're not going to be able to find out what's really going on and interview the other side.
Right.
So I think she was.
Well, it's like it's kind of like the Jane Fonda thing back in Vietnam, right? I mean, it's going to be used as propaganda. You're not really.
Well, I would say much worse to go to Syria under the circumstances with Assad. I mean, this guy's a butcher. He tortured that Canadian engineer, Syrian Canadian, on behalf of the CIA. And New York Times last week had a story, and Democracy Now! Had the reporters of documentation. There are over 100,000 political prisoners, tens of thousands dead in this country and tortured. It's brutal. So yeah, that would not have been a good one to take.
In early August of 2019, it was announced that presidential candidate Mike Gravel was dropping out of the race. Gravel's Twitter account released a video of Gravel endorsing Bernie Sanders for president. Many news outlets picked up this story without contacting Mike Gravel. Essentially, the media just acted as stenographers and repeated what the Twitter video had said. As such, I reached out to Mike Gravel, and I broke the story that Mike Gravel was not just endorsing Bernie Sanders for president, he was endorsing either Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard. In uncovering this story, I subsequently uncovered a lot of really uncomfortable things about the Mike Gravel campaign and how they were representing the former U.S. Senator. One actually had to do with Howie Hawkins and an email that went out addressed from Mike Gravel's campaign asking people to donate to Howie Hawkins. At the time, Mike Gravel did not know who Howie Hawkins was or what he stood for. There were also instances of Mike Gravel disagreeing with his own Twitter account and him stating that he was uncomfortable with the idea of a Gravel Institute. And finally was Mike Gravel's very vocal support for a second 9/11 commission. Gravel talked about this in multiple interviews. This is something that he was extremely in favor of and that his campaign should have been talking about. But of course they didn't because the people running his campaign really were misrepresenting Mike Gravel. So let's take a look back. These are clips from several different interviews that I did with Mike Gravel. They touch on all of these different topics. So please do watch this segment and come to your own conclusions about how the people running Mike Gravel's campaign represented him in the 2020 presidential election. Senator Gravel, welcome back to Primo Nutmeg.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being back on the show, especially on such short notice. So I just wanted to clear up any kind of confusion about your campaign and what's happening at this point. I know that you were kept out of the debates. The DNC wasn't including you in polling, even though you met the donor requirement. You still, because you weren't being included in polls, thus did not poll at the requisite amount needed. So is it true that you are now dropping out of the 2020 presidential race?
Well, I'm not dropping out of the race. I'm dropping out as a candidate for myself. I still want to maintain my presence in the race by endorsing Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard. So I'll continue in that capacity. I believe that both campaigns will use me as a surrogate as time goes on here. So I'm very committed to them. There's nothing unusual about supporting two candidates when there's two offices open. One is for president, the other is vice president.
So when you say that you are endorsing both Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, are you supporting one for president and one for vice president, or are you supporting either one to be president or vice president?
Either one. In other words, let's see what happens in the polls, and let's see what happens in Iowa and New Hampshire, and clearly the field will narrow down, and we'll see how Tulsi and Bernie play out as the field narrows.
Okay. I guess this might be a little bit unusual, so some folks may not have quite understood. So just to clarify, you recorded two different videos, one saying that you were endorsing Bernie Sanders and one saying that you were endorsing Tulsi Gabbard because you would be happy with either one being president and either one being vice president.
Correct.
Okay. So in coming to this decision, was there any kind of deliberation about if maybe you should be picking one over the other, or you just felt that you should kind of split it evenly and support both?
Well, most of my supporters in my presidential candidate are very much pro-Bernie supporters. And at the beginning, when we first decided to let the kids run my campaign, we had agreed that at the end of the campaign, we'd be supporting Bernie. However, from the get-go, I was very impressed with Tulsi Gabbard. And I see her as a real coming powerhouse because of her charisma, her level-headedness, her courage in opposing the military-industrial complex. And so I'm supportive of her and Bernie. Bernie I supported and contributed to him the last time. We are taking the funds and contributing our funds to Bernie and to Tulsi equally The law permits us to transfer $4,000 each, and we've done that, or we're doing it. And then in the course of the campaign, we can design ads in support of Bernie and in support of Tulsi. As long as we don't coordinate with them, we can then design these ads and then put these ads on at our expense. And so we ended the process with about $150,000 in the bank, and we have not spent it. The kids have been very parsimonious in this regard, and we've not had any great travel expenses. I have not traveled, so therefore we have this money available. Now it's a question of and I've asked the campaign managers to go ahead and think of the kind of campaign we could wage in support of Bernie, independent of Bernie, and Tulsi and independent of Tulsi. But we've transferred the maximum that we're permitted under the law, and that is $4,000 to each.
I understand. So just to be clear about how this started, you're saying that when David Oakes and Henry Williams first approached you to run, that it was always sort of agreed upon that Bernie Sanders would get your endorsement, but you're saying that Tulsi Gabbard has impressed you, so you also want to endorse her.
That's correct, and it was really agreed upon. That was a quid pro quo that we never assumed that I would win the presidency. So we decided at the very beginning that we would endorse Bernie, and we've done that. And like I say, I've developed, independent of my backers, these kids, the support of Tulsi Gabbard, who I think has great potential, and will eventually be, either this round or the next round, will eventually be president of the United States. She's that unusual. And of course, she comes from a religious family background. And so she had, as a child, certain views that she articulated that were not acceptable to the progressives. But she has since thrown off these views, has apologized for them, and is very much supportive of the progressive agenda. And I just the other day read over on her platform all of the items. They're essentially the same items as Bernie Sanders endorses. So from my point of view, ideologically speaking, I don't see much difference between Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi was the first one to take on the military-industrial complex. Bernie came to that after Tulsi. And so Tulsi had a better foreign policy than Bernie did initially, but Bernie has come around to her foreign policy, and that is to close most of the military bases that exist abroad and to cut down on regime change and sanctions. So from my point of view, they're both the same. The ideal, in my case, would be one's president, one's vice president, and the vice versa.
That makes sense. I'm just curious too, because I know that you've spoken favorably of some other candidates in the race. Were you also considering maybe, endorsing other candidates? I mean, since you're at 2, why not, also endorse Marianne Williamson or Andrew Yang or Elizabeth Warren or whoever?
Well, I certainly admire Elizabeth Warren's positions on issues. That goes without saying. And then, of course, Marianne Williamson. I just have admired her in the past and admire her stance that she's taken at this point. Andrew Yang, I think, makes a credible choice. I really am opposed to what's his name, Joe Biden, who I know and I think is ideological, is horrible ideology, and of course I'm not a supporter at all of Buttigieg, who I feel is a bit of an empty shirt and would literally be a puppet for the military-industrial complex were he to get elected to high office. And he leaves the subject alone. If you can tell an empty shirt politically when they say a lot but don't say anything, as they say a lot and don't mean anything because they don't want to alienate people. And the military-industrial complex landed on Mayor Pete, early on because he clearly would be a puppet for the military-industrial complex were he to get elected.
So I just, again, wanted to get some background because, as you mentioned, the teens run your Twitter account. And so earlier today, they put out the video of you endorsing Tulsi Gabbard. Was the video that you, I'm sorry, they put out the video of you endorsing Bernie Sanders, and that's on your Twitter page now, but not the one of you endorsing Tulsi Gabbard. Is the video of you endorsing Tulsi Gabbard the same as the video of you endorsing Bernie Sanders? Is there any difference?
Not perceptibly, but they'll be releasing that also. We've given the raw material over to the Gabbard staff, and as we gave the raw material over to the Bernie staff, and this was recorded at my home on Sunday, and so they're obviously releasing them at this point.
Okay. It just, there seemed to be a difference because your Twitter account put out the Bernie Sanders video, but I guess you handed off the video to Tulsi Gabbard's campaign to put out.
Well, the Tulsi campaign had not requested a video. Bernie did, and we had a video crew come over. And so while the crew was here, I took advantage to cut a endorsement of Tulsi. And they weren't aware of it until it was done. And then I made them aware of its existence, and we made every effort to get it to them early this morning or late last night.
I understand. So this video crew, they were from the Bernie Sanders campaign?
No, it's a video crew, Sky Whalen, who has been doing a lot of videography for us. Or for himself. He has a budget to do this and try and see if he can entice a major network to do a documentary on my candidacy. So this was the crew that has been to my home at least now 3 times.
Okay. So just another question on this subject, because there was an article that came out yesterday by Gideon Resnick in the Daily Beast, saying that you were going to drop out and endorse Bernie Sanders. Have you seen that Daily Beast article?
No, I haven't.
Okay. There was a quote in there from David Oakes, and I just wanted to read it to you, or the segment of the report. It says, according to Oakes, Representative Tulsi Gabbard's campaign initially tried to seek Gravel's endorsement. Oakes said they tried to, quote, slowball the Gabbard campaign, but Gabbard eventually got in touch with Gravel. Ultimately, they thought it would be more beneficial for the Alaska Democrat to back Sanders, both because he has a better shot of winning the nomination and because of Gabbard's divisiveness among some on the left. Quote, we thought that a Bernie endorsement would be the best move, Oakes explained. We like Tulsi. Tulsi is better than the vast majority of candidates, but we know that Tulsi is most likely going to be dropping out in a few weeks, end quote. And it goes on to say that Gabbard has given no indication that she's going to drop out. Do you know why David Oakes may have been alluding to Tulsi Gabbard possibly dropping out?
No, I don't know the source of that. And the rest of David's statement is accurate, but that's not accurate. In fact, the Gabbard, Tulsi is going to be doing a military stint in her obligation on the end of September or thereabouts. And they've asked me if I would be a surrogate, and I said I would. And also, Bernie's people have asked me to be a surrogate, or I'm not sure if they asked me to be a surrogate, but if they do, I certainly would agree. So I really have no problems endorsing both and pushing both. I recognize that Bernie's ahead, and there's likelihood that he will get the nomination before Tulsi. But I would inveigh upon all of my influence to turn around and have Bernie, if he did get the nomination, to select Tulsi as his running mate. I think she would be the ideal in that regard, because I believe eventually she'll be president of the United States. She'll be the one to break the glass ceiling. I doubt that there's any other candidate, and there's quite a number of women running, but I doubt any one of those have the capacity to break the glass ceiling at this point in time. So the whole undertaking has been extremely harmonious between the kids and myself. I can't tell you how much I admire their skills, their integrity, and their beliefs. And my only concern is, of course, they came up with the idea of having an institute. I'm not enamored of that. The question becomes who's going to run the institute. And they assumed that it would be easy to find another couple guys to do what they're doing. And I've shared with them that that's not easy at all. The uniqueness of what they've done, I don't think is particularly replicable. And why the campaign has received so much attention is obviously because it's so unique, where you have two teenagers that are running a campaign of a former presidential candidate and an existing presidential candidate, and doing it very, very adroitly and with gifted talent. So I want the kids to go back to school, finish their education, and then pursue a career based on the experience they've acquired. And we, of course, will keep up our contact ideologically and tactically while they're in school. David in Oxford and Henry at Columbia. And they'll be coming out to see me late probably August, early September. And then we'll do some planning as to what can be done in the next year prior to the convention and after the convention.
How many times have you met them in person?
I've never met physically David, because when Henry came out here with Church, I forget his first name in a moment, but they came out here and did some videography. We redid the spot on the rock in the water.
Right.
But David rather got sick and hospitalized for a couple of days, so he missed that meeting. But Henry and David and whoever they choose to bring out of the volunteers will have a meeting in late September, late August or early September, and plot over what we'll do and how we'll parcel out the monies that are left in the campaign so that we comply accurately with the law.
Yeah, I believe that there was a tweet put out at one point saying that the donations to your campaign would be going to the city of Flint, Michigan, because of the water crisis there. Do you know why that may have changed and why that may now be going to an institute?
That was a quick statement made by one of the kids earlier than that. We always had the get-go agreement that they would sit down with me and we would parcel out how we would use the monies. And so Flint situation has changed from what it used to be. And so we'll make a donation to Flint, but the primary sums will be, as we've already divvied up whatever we can legally with Tulsi and Bernie, but the rest of the sums will be used probably for a campaign for both of those that we will wage independently. And then also I'd be more prone to donate to communications areas, op-ed news, the Democracy Now!, the Institute for Accuracy. So those are communications systems that are doing great work for democracy in improving the information level of people. And so I would be prone to support them with that. So that's what we'll do. We'll sit down, the three of us and whoever else chooses to come out, and we'll make a final decision on the distribution of what monies we have. And I would be prone to distribute all of it, not to hang on to any of it. That could just cause mischief down the road.
Something else I wanted to ask you about today was Howie Hawkins. Are you endorsing him?
No, I don't know much about him, and so I haven't endorsed anybody else in that regard.
Do you know who Howie Hawkins is?
Well, he sent me some emails, but I haven't read them. I've just been so busy with so many emails that I get. So, to my knowledge, no, I haven't endorsed him, and I don't know what he represents in that regard.
Okay, because there was an email that went out from your campaign or addressed from your campaign that was asking people to donate to the Howie Hawkins campaign. Did you know about that email?
No, I didn't. And you have to understand that my campaign was run by teenagers, and on a couple of occasions they can endorse who they want as individuals, but they don't necessarily bind me on any endorsements in that regard. And so I agree totally to pull the American troops out. It is not a loss of support of Kurds. The Kurds participated in the war in that area because of their own self-interest. We should have never been there to begin with. This is a regional problem that should be addressed by the regional players. We are not a regional player in that part of the world.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on this quote. This quote says, "There is no higher disgrace to America than the abandonment of the Kurds, fighters for freedom and independence, to the hard right forces of Erdogan. Every American should hang their head in shame." What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think we should hang our head in shame. I think we should hold our head high and bring home the American troops who have no business being there, period.
Do you know who said that quote?
Pardon me?
Do you know who said that quote?
No, who?
That was your Twitter account.
My Twitter account. Okay, well, this goes to prove that sometimes the kids that ran my campaign don't always have the same views that I have or haven't listened to me. And so it's unfortunate that it's a quote that appears to come from me, but it doesn't come from me in this regard. And the fact that these teenage kids have views that are not vetted by years of experience is self-evident. And so I don't have to be angry at them. They have an expression of their views. Whenever we get together, we go over with this, and I think they bring about a certain enlightenment on my part. What they have done that I really buy into is they support the concept of direct democracy. They support creating and operating a legislature of the people. That's what floats my boat, and I don't particularly want to take them to task for views that they have that are at variance from my views. It's unfortunate that the only way they have to do that is to use my Twitter account, which may add to the confusion, but so be it. There's confusion right now in the entire political leadership of the American government.
I actually came across a tweet by your former, I believe his campaign manager, David Oakes, that I thought was interesting the other day. He said, "Part of the left's problem is a lack of respect for conservative isolationists, localists, populists, anti-globalists. Conservative non-interventionism has a rich history, and to paint all of them as Nazis is factually and strategically moronic." And something I guess that confused me about that is that I know that earlier this year, I guess you had received an invite from Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, he's one of these people who was in favor of the Bush administration in years past. But more recently, he's really been kind of coming from that non-interventionist conservative perspective. He was actually, I believe, the only Fox News commentator who spoke out against Trump's assassination of the Iranian commander. Again, I thought it was strange because I know that they had turned down the request for you to appear on Tucker Carlson earlier this year, and I just thought I'd ask you what your thoughts were on that. Did you want to appear on Tucker Carlson, or just what happened there?
No, I was prepared to appear on Tucker Carlson. This was one of the judgments that they made, and I was not aware of it until after the fact. But these are minor differences. My attitude is that you talk to anybody and everybody that wants to hear your voice. Tucker Carlson, incidentally, has been very kind to Tulsi Gabbard for the same reason that he was wanting to probably interview me, and that was that she's very outspoken against foreign involvement, regime change wars, and really has been providing a great deal of leadership, which has cost her dearly because mainstream media has not even addressed any of the issues she brings up. They'd rather go to Buttigieg, who's nothing but a puppet for Wall Street and the military-industrial complex.
Also in August of 2019, I drove to New York City to interview economist Richard Wolff. This was a very enlightening interview for lots of reasons, But the one segment of this interview that made lots of headlines was Richard Wolff talking about Jordan Peterson. It's an interesting clip. It speaks for itself. So once again, let's take a look back at August of 2019. And this is episode number 189 with Richard Wolff.
You weren't able to debate Jordan Peterson, right?
Shall I tell you that story? Let me tell you the story with your camera. Okay. I get a call from a group of students at Boise State University in Boise, Idaho. They're having a day devoted to the work of Jordan Peterson, which is of great interest, they say, to students and faculty at Boise State. Okay? That's what they tell me. And they want, as part of it, for there to be a debate in which someone who, a debate, because he said things, they quoted to me, about Marxism, that one of which was, one that stuck in my mind, no Marxist dares to debate him. I laughed and I said, I will. They knew that somehow. And they laughed too. And they said, well, we'll bring you out here. We're bringing him. Because it's a day devoted to his work, so it's flattering to him. They're bringing him. Would I come out and debate? Yes. So we talked a little bit, and the dates were fixed and so forth. And they were in touch with him to work it out. So I have to admit, I didn't know who that was. I mean, when he said, no Marxist debate, and it was clever for them to say, I said, well, okay, I'll do it. That was good bait for me.
Sure.
So then I looked him up and I learned a little bit about him, Google. About 5 or 6 weeks later, I mean, it was into the future, it was months away. 5 or 6 weeks later, the same people called me back and said, awkwardly, he's pulled out. I said, what are you talking about? I thought we had all disagreed. Yes, we had it all agreed. He's pulled out. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, he raised the fee. And we can't, it's a public school. Boise State is not a private public school. And they can't pay, yes, I think 50 grand or some enormous amount of money. So, but they were very pissed because they saw, I mean, I'm interpreting, but they saw his financing issues. And I don't know if any of this is true, this is what I was told. They saw that as a way for him to escape the thing. In any case, bottom line, he didn't come. He refused to participate, even though it was all about his work. And they said to me, would you come out here without the debate and just talk about his work and how Marxism differs from his characterization of it? Yes, I said. So I went out there to Boise, by myself. There were other people. I wasn't the only invited guest. There were others from around the country who came and talked. It was a day of workshops and talks about Jordan Peterson's work mostly. And I gave a talk. And I mentioned him a little bit at the beginning. I was critical mostly because for him, he said, I mean, once I looked at him, he said horrible things. What was it? How could anyone be a Marxist because of Stalin? And then he said Stalin killed, and he gave numbers. 10 million people, I think it was, some huge number of people he killed. Or by implication, Marxism killed, because for him, Marxism and Stalin killing were more or less the same. So I criticized that. I explained to him, in case he needed it, that Marxism is a bigger, older thing than Mr. Stalin. I tried to remind him that history is full of killings done in the name of things that we don't condemn for that. And I tried to give him examples that would make him twitch. So I gave examples like, I don't know, Christianity. I reminded him of the Spanish Inquisition, which killed large numbers of people. I reminded him of wars in the medieval time in which Christian princes killed each other. Catholics to Catholics, Catholics to Protestants, the whole Reformation, the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War. You know, those were long. A lot of people died.
Right.
And one side was carrying the cross, and the other side was carrying the cross, and each side believed that God was on their side as they slaughtered each other. So if you want to tell me that killing large numbers of people in the name, say, of Christianity means you shouldn't be a Christian, I mean, I know I'm playing with him, okay, but that's a strange argument, and my guess is no one in this room would buy it. Nobody in that room did. I mean, in the Boise State. You know, it's a strange argument. And then I played a little more, but it's playing because I don't take this stuff seriously. This only works in a society like the United States, where you've had this sort of 50-year taboo in which you demonize this and you find horrible things and you associate the horrible things with this kind of stuff. I reminded him, that in the 20th century had two things that it called world wars, in which way more people were killed than Stalin ever managed. Those were wars among capitalist countries, fighting over colonies, fighting over trade. Am I supposed to say, well, see, capitalism kills? I mean, by his logic, this is as good an argument as he has. So what? If we're going to count the dead, I think you're in trouble. I think it's a crazy metric, but you brought it up, so I went after him that way. He had problems with it. He produced a couple of videos in which he went after me, but he wouldn't debate.
Why won't he? Have you tried to contact him to see if he'll meet with you?
No. To repeat this, I don't find these things edifying. I'm not, I don't find debates mostly very, very. I know people like them, and I respect that people do. But I find what you end up doing is you're scoring points. You're not making an argument. Often you don't even have the time to make an argument because people are at each other. So.
Weeks later, in September of 2019, I had Tulsi Gabbard back on the show on episode number 192. We talked about a lot of different subjects, but one that was especially interesting was me extending an invitation from the Green Party's Jill Stein that Tulsi Gabbard run with the Green Party. As you may recall, there was a lot of talk around this time about Tulsi Gabbard leaving the Democratic Party and running with the Green Party. This also played into the famous clip of Hillary Clinton essentially alleging that Tulsi Gabbard was a Russian agent along with Jill Stein. And here's a clip of me effectively acting as the bridge between these two, extending Jill Stein's offer to Tulsi Gabbard to run with the Green Party.
Another candidate that is getting a lot of grassroots interest right now is Tulsi Gabbard. And the things that she has said, I personally find, amazing that there's a candidate out there saying them. And she talks about how neoliberals and neoconservatives in both parties collude to bring us into regime change wars, that we're in a new Cold War. I think she's used the term military industrial complex. She's quoted Noam Chomsky. And it's really shocking. And obviously, there's been a backlash from the party and from the corporate media because of that. If it was somehow possible for her to win the Democratic nomination, I mean, would she be a candidate worth voting for?
These are big hypotheticals.
Sure.
Personally, I find her comments to be very on point and very similar with our message, in 2016 and 2012 and going back, and it's really great that someone, and comparable to Dennis Kucinich, what she's saying is what I think any really informed and honest observer would have to say, so like we're shocked. We're shocked that
Exactly.
the system allows, a little reality check in it. That is absolutely shocking. I can't really get my hopes up. I'm very concerned with building a real system of integrity that's not going to get wiped out in this election. That's not going to get wiped out by a party that opposes it, which was my summary of what I thought about Sanders' campaign, which is that you can't have a revolution in a counter-revolutionary party. It's just not going to happen. We really have to build, a political structure for transformation. And I think she should become a Green, and I think that would be really magical, and that would really be powerful and would make change in a way that can't be beaten back. She might not win the election, but that way, we would build a really firm base for building forward.
I also had Jill Stein on the show and some Green Party candidates that are running in the 2020 election. And she and someone else had mentioned that they might like you to run with the Green Party. Is that something that you would ever consider, or are you dead set on supporting the Democratic nominee, whoever that might be?
Yeah, I'm not going to run as a third-party candidate or as an independent. The reality is that our country has a two-party system right now, and frankly, it's not viable to think that a third-party candidate in this day and age will be able to be successful in that election. My energy is I've always been a Democrat, and my energy is focused on being the Democratic nominee, being in that position where I can be the president and leading our party towards bringing about the kinds of reforms that it needs, rooting out the corruption within our own party, and making it so that the Democratic Party truly represents the interests of the people and our planet.
Then a couple weeks later, on episode number 194, I finally had former Governor Jesse Ventura on the show. We talked about a lot of different subjects over the course of 45 minutes. It's a really great conversation, and I recommend that everyone goes back and listens to the full interview. But one clip that made headlines was Jesse Ventura announcing that he was interested in seeking the Green Party's nomination, and also that he was interested in running with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. You have talked about running for president, the possibility of you running for president for years.
Yeah.
You've also, been supportive of people on both kind of the right and the left, the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. I know you've been supportive of. You've spoken fondly of Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, Ralph Nader, Gary Johnson, Jill Stein. I think that it would be awesome if you were to run for president and seek the nomination of both the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. Is that something that might ever...
I don't think that could happen because the Libertarians don't believe in climate change. That's what drove me away from them. That's why I went to the Green Party, because I believe that is the most important thing on the planet right now. And the Libertarians don't buy it.
So will you ever run for president? Will you seek the Green Party?
I don't know.
Nomination?
You'll find out in the spring.
Okay.
Why would I do it now? Wait till the Pikers are gone.
Okay. Well, Governor...
it's all about tactics, man. It's tactics. That's how you win. It ain't time now. It's too early.
I sincerely hope that you do run for president this year, and
Yeah.
I think it would be awesome if you did.
Well, let me just leave you with this. What do you think about a ticket? Imagine this ticket. Governor Jesse Ventura and Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
That sounds great. I would love to see that.
He quits the Democratic Party and joins me with the Greens.
Let's make it happen. Again, Jill Stein isn't running this year, so the Green Party is having a contentious...
Don't hold your breath, but it's far too early. You got to at least get in the year of the election before you worry about that stuff.
The following month, on episode number 199, I had Jill Stein back on the show. We talked about a lot of different topics, but in particular, we talked about Howie Hawkins and the alleged rigging of the Green Party nomination. And we also talked about Jesse Ventura. This kind of surprised me just because, seeing what happened to you and what happened to the Green Party and this new McCarthyism that seems very apparent, especially among progressives, it seemed as though Howie had a very different take on that, and he had more of a mainstream sort of approach that there definitely was collusion and that this was a provable fact. I don't know if you saw that interview, if you had any thoughts on just if the Green Party should be nominating somebody who is essentially adopting the Russiagate narrative.
So I've talked to Howie about this at great length, and actually I owe him a briefing paper because, and I just, it makes me very sad that people in the Green Party who should know better are vulnerable to this kind of, warmongering and propaganda. And, it takes, I think it takes some degree of information and, skepticism to like be able to reject this stuff. It should not be taken at face value. When James Clapper says to Congress, that no, we are not and never have been, surveilling the American public, or when all of the security agencies are raving about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, how many times do you have to go through this? Or the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that initiated the war in Vietnam. How many of these things do you have to go through before you start not taking statements of our security agencies at face value? They may be right, but they may be wrong, and you really need to look at corroborating evidence. And unfortunately, there's been such a media, orgy around Mueller, around Russiagate, around all the hysteria that gets way blown out of proportion, and then they never publish the retractions when the stories turn out to be fake. Right. To my mind, it's very sad when people who should know better are falling for this stuff.
So what did Howie say about it when you talked to him?
He pulled back a bit, quite a bit, and said that, he really looked forward to that discussion. I had to dig deep, because I was being accused.
Yeah, well, you're the victim of it.
Well, and let me say, I knew right away that the Steele report was a bunch of crap because it had lies about me. It said that my trip to Russia was paid for by Russia, and that was part of how they co-opted me. That's part of how they engaged me. And the Steele report said that Russia's strategy was to engage people like me and third parties, and that it had been successful in doing things like sponsoring my trip to Russia. So I knew that it was full of BS. So if it was lying about me, what else was it lying about? So I was not inclined whatsoever to take it at face value, or the intelligence agency's report, and it really distressed me that people who know me and who were informed about our campaign could see that and then not just, presume that this fear campaign is BS. So this is, I think enough people have talked to Howie that he's starting to see this differently. And he seems to feel that, well, he's just being skeptical about authoritarians. Well, that's true. You should be skeptical about authoritarians, but that includes, the authoritarians here in the US of A and the kinds of, warmongering and abuse that's taking place here, which in the words of Martin Luther King, we are bar none, the greatest purveyor of violence the world has ever known. And that should inform your thinking about this. So I think, I talked to Howie about new knowledge and about, the way the whole social media campaign is ridiculous.
I had Jesse Ventura on the show recently, and he had floated the idea of possibly running for the Green Party nomination with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So will you ever run for president? Will you seek the Green Party nomination?
I don't know. You'll find out in the spring.
Okay.
Why would I do it now? Wait till the Pikers are gone.
Okay. Well,
Come
Governor...
on, it's all about tactics, man. It's tactics. That's how you win. It ain't time now. It's too early.
I sincerely hope that you do run for president this year, and I think it would be awesome if you did.
Well, let me just leave you with this. What do you think about a ticket? Imagine this ticket. Governor Jesse Ventura and Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
That sounds great. I would love to see that.
He quits the Democratic Party and joins me with the Greens.
What would you think about if he did say in a few months, yes, I want to run for the Green Party presidential nomination?
I'd be really interested in talking with him. I certainly would not shut it down. Jesse is a very powerful spokesperson, our visions and agendas compatible? Would he be running as a Green, and would he be running to build a party? Would be my question. But I would regard that as a really interesting development. If Robert F. Kennedy was interested in running as,
and again, that was just Jesse talking. So.
I see. Yeah, I would certainly be interested in dialoguing with both of them.
Would he be able to run after the November 4th cutoff? Or is that a cut? Do you know if that's a cutoff for being able to run, or is that just being listed online as a recognized candidate?
Yeah, actually, I don't know, but I can find out.
Okay. Do you think that there would be this similar sort of dynamic where there would be people in places of power who might support Howie Hawkins working against a Jesse Ventura campaign, or if some, Cynthia McKinney or just some other person decided they want to enter the race?
Yeah, I think it would be really important to ensure that that people who have a conflict of interest because they represent another campaign should not be in, they should be recused from decision making around this. And I'm not, I don't know who that would be. Is this a steering committee interpretation or what? I don't know, but I would hope that this is guided by rules and it doesn't require a decision of an administrator. If the rules allow another person to become a member of the party and seek the nomination, if they qualify by the criteria, they should be able to do that, and then let the voters decide in their primaries in the various states. Let the voters decide.
Finally, on episode number 200, I had Jimmy Dore on the show for the first time. One of the topics that I wanted to ask him about was the Young Turks. As you can see in this clip, originally Jimmy Dore was not that harsh on the Young Turks, nor their embrace of Russiagate. However, he was candid and honest. This clip is interesting in retrospect because recently, as many of you know, on Primo Radical number 236, Jimmy Dore was back on the show to talk about not just the Young Turks, but also Kyle Kulinski. As such, I think it'll be informative to watch these two clips back to back. Again, a lot of time passed between these two interviews. The first one was recorded at the end of October 2019, and the second one was recorded on the 4th of July, 2021. You, of course, were with the Young Turks for a long time. You're part of their network. And to some degree, I think that they have also pushed Russiagate a little bit. And in other ways, well, yeah, a bit. So, and also I know Emma has been really outspoken against Tulsi Gabbard. So, it just seems like there's also, this sort of MSNBC influence happening in the Young Turks. And I just thought, I thought I'd ask you if you had any kind of take on that or just any kind of insight you might be able to provide.
All I can tell you is that when I started doing this show called Aggressive Progressives, because the main show took a editorial turn, right? So it was after the primer, after they decided Bernie wasn't viable anymore, they went full speed, 100% Hillary, and they had a segment called Loser Donald. So they would bash Donald Trump, and it just so that was the impetus for Steve O and I, who was the COO of the company, to start a show called Aggressive Progressives as kind of a counter narrative to the way the editorial direction of the main show. And I thought it would be good. We'd be complimentary, right? So we would point out, everybody has blind spots or whatever. Here's what we think. Here's what they, and I thought it would be a good thing. And then I thought that our reporting would, would expose things and people would see it and go, oh, I didn't know this. And it would change how they did what they were doing. That didn't happen. It turns out that, my effort to shine a light on contrary narratives of Russiagate was not, it was, it just created not a good environment. It wasn't welcomed. And I get that. I understand. And so that's all I can say is that I was hoping that my reporting. So do you know anyone else who won an award doing their reporting on Russiagate? I don't. I don't know anybody besides Aaron Mate, and we had Aaron Mate on our show constantly, and we would bring him on. I bring him on Aggressive Progressives when I was in the Young Turk studio. I bring him on this show, and we would debunk all the bullshit of Russiagate, and it wasn't hard to do. And so I just it's weird. We got it right, 100% right.
And I think you've been
got it right, 100% right. And I thought that would be more appreciated. That's all I was looking for, and it wasn't. So that's all I can tell you now. The way their editorial direction. I mean, I can't speak to that. I don't know why. I can't tell you why they've taken the editorial direction they've taken or why they do what they do. That's up to you. I mean, you watch it and make your own decisions. But I was real proud of the work we did at Aggressive Progressives. We debunked Russiagate on a weekly basis. We debunked the poor Venezuela coverage. We debunked the gas attacks in Syria. We were way ahead of everybody on all this stuff. And I did a lot of it in the TYT newsroom on Aggressive Progressives. And again, Aaron Mate won an award for that kind of reporting. Of course, they can't give an award to a jagoff comedian who says fuck every other sentence. So they gave it to Aaron Mate because he had the imprimatur of The Nation magazine. But again, like I said, Aaron Mate is such a generous guy and such a solid dude that he said he shares that award with our show. So
awesome.
I'm going to accept it. How about that? I'm going to go ahead and accept that. So here we were doing award-winning journalism on stuff like Venezuela, and stuff like Russiagate, and stuff like Julian Assange, and debunking everybody in the mainstream news media. And so I'm really proud of the work we did there, and it was disheartening to me. I thought that if I kept doing good work and I kept showing, the debunking of Russiagate, that eventually everybody would catch on. That didn't happen. It was heartbreaking for me. And that's all I can tell you.
So another thing that I did want to discuss in all of this is the $20 million, because one thing that Kyle brought up in his first video, he showed an older video of you being asked about it and saying that you didn't think at the time that $20 million had changed Cenk's perspective.
I don't think Cenk is preaching a false narrative for investment money. I think he truly believes it. I take it, Cenk is what I call a natural Republican, right? So he was a Republican at first for a long time, and he talks about this openly, about how he even led pro-Iraq war rallies, right? The first one. And so that's why people are drawn to him, because it's this great journey where he went from this, meathead, into this progressive, right? And so that's what appealed to me about his journey and about Cenk. So I think, if he is what we consider to be wrong on an issue, it's just because he's genuinely believes it. That money, that investment money, that's not how Cenk works. And if he's making a mistake, it's just he's making a mistake. Or I disagree with him. I disagree with him before they took that money. Well, the first gas attack in 2013, and Barack Obama wanted to bomb Syria over that, and they believed it.
And it was proven false.
It was since proven false.
And honestly, so looking back, I have noticed Cenk seemingly kind of going back and forth on this a few different times. There are times when it seems as though he was saying that that the gas attacks did take place and they didn't take place, and advocating for bombing and not bombing, and saying that Tucker Carlson was copying what he was saying about not attacking. Like it seemed very all over the place. So and again, in his video, Kyle was saying that Cenk described himself previously as a soft interventionist. So I guess I'm just wondering from you, how much do you think the $20 million really has changed TYT, or does Cenk really have any kind of underlying philosophy at all, or is he just kind of all over the place, and has he been that way for years?
Well, Cenk's instinct are always Republican right wing. Now, that's not bad if you're a Republican right winger, but if you're supposed to be a progressive, that's not good. His instincts have always been right wing. He was for the Libya bombing. He did pro-war rallies for Iraq. He bragged about that he was for the Libya war. He bragged about it. I showed the video on my show. And he was giddy over the Libya, turning it into a failed state, going along with Hillary Clinton and the imperialists and the neocons. And then he wanted to bomb Syria more and more. I was the only one on that panel. There was Johnny Ayarola, Cenk, and Ben Mankiewicz, and I was the only anti-war voice on there. They were all sitting there trying to convince me, come on, Jimmy, don't you want to bomb? Don't you want to bomb? So the money totally changed them. And when I was asked that question by Lauren Steiner, that was before the change. They had just gotten the money, and I didn't see the changes that had happened yet. But boy, oh boy, did they change after that. It was like they just went nuts. And I knew. So, and then it was like a year later that executive at the TYT told me that they have to move towards the center. And so I didn't know.
Can you just share any more details about that specifically? Like, what was that conversation like, and just how was that framed exactly?
I was saying the same shit. I'm like, well, if he's taking money from these people, how is it not going to affect it? It's obviously going to affect, right? And he goes, well, we have to move towards the center. We know that. That's a direct quote. So, and I don't want to say who that was, I mean, Ben Mankiewicz was one of my best friends over there. I had a lot of good friends. I don't want to say who said it, but that was said. And then and when I saw them smear Julian Assange, I was like, oh, they're doing this. They're signaling to a donor. You could tell Cenk didn't even believe what he was saying, just like they don't believe what they're saying about Aaron Matei, just like they don't believe what they're saying about me, just like they don't believe what they're saying about Syria. You could tell in their face, they don't believe it. And he didn't believe. Cenk was just like, oh, I have to do this because he's signaling to a donor. And they're out of money. Cenk blew through that $20 million. He's got to get more donors. They got to get more money. And so I don't know what who knows? Maybe Cenk's going for that NED Bellingcat money right now, because that's who they're using to report on Syria. Bellingcat. Anna was tweeting out Bellingcat. She's retweeting Bellingcat, which, if you know who they are, they're a CIA cutout. That's who she was using for her info on Syria as a journalist, while she was tweeting out a doctored video, a deceptively edited video, to smear an anti-war journalist, Aaron Matei. And Kyle didn't want to punch her in the face for that. Isn't that interesting? He didn't even fucking mention it, Primo. Kyle, what do you think you're doing? Who do you think you're fooling? You want to come for me in a dishonest way? You will pay a price.
So, Jimmy,
I'm fucking Dave Rubin? That's who you think you're dealing with?
In June of 2020, on episode 220, Jesse Ventura was back on the show. We talked about the Green Party in depth. Ventura explained why he was interested in the Green Party nomination and how he was effectively gaslit out of the nomination. He also expressed interest in being a write-in candidate, and as many of you recall, Jesse Ventura actually did end up winning the Green Party of Alaska's nomination, where he appeared on the ballot in November with Cynthia McKinney. But let's jump back to June of 2020 to hear Jesse Ventura's big announcement about being a write-in candidate.
And in fact, I'll tell you right now, we'll do it right here. Yeah, I'm running for president. What I mean by that is, there ain't no candidate for me, so I'm going to write myself in. That's what I'm doing. I've already come to that decision. Since there's no candidate out there, and any of the parties or any of anything that satisfies my personal need, then I still want to vote. I still want to exercise my constitutional right, so I will be writing myself in for president. Now, I'm being clear. That doesn't mean I've opened the door to a candidacy. If I win, I'm serious though, if America writes me in and I win, I'll do the job.
Awesome. That's great news.
I don't think I would have any choice. I would have to. How could I walk away from that?
Well, Governor, I really do appreciate you being back on the show, and I appreciate your announcement that you're receptive to being a write-in candidate. So, and just to be clear about that, as being receptive as a write-in candidate, that means that you're not going to be endorsing any other party's candidate for president, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
I'm not going to endorse anybody. And in fact, all I'm saying is there's no candidate for me right now, so I'll be voting for myself. I want to be clear on this. I am not an official candidate because I don't want to lose my job and health insurance.
Right.
But if people write me in, I can't do nothing about that. I'm not on the ballot. So
that's true.
I think that gets me off the hook. As far as being able to keep my job.
Finally, folks, I want to leave you with a clip from the last episode of this show. That was episode number 242 with Glenn Greenwald. This interview was enlightening for a lot of reasons, but one was our in-depth discussion of TYT and the influence of Jeffrey Katzenberg, the billionaire who, along with others, invested $20 million into TYT in 2017. I enjoyed this interview a lot. It was great to talk about these subjects with Glenn Greenwald and also make comparisons to The Intercept and their investor, Pierre Omidyar. So let's take a look back at this last clip. This was recorded last month. This is Primo Radical episode number 242 with Glenn Greenwald. And one of the real motivations for me wanting to have you on the show right now is due to the recent TYT feud that's been taking place primarily between Cenk and Anna with Jimmy Dore and Aaron Mate, but also you kind of got involved with that as well, as did Max Blumenthal. So what I've really come to notice over the last couple of years is that there seems to be a large rift between folks like TYT, David Pakman, Vosh, Sam Cedar, with more anti-imperialist folks like you, Jimmy Dore, Aaron Mate, other folks at the Gray Zone, Matt Taibbi, Katie Halper. And it seems to have really come to the forefront in this feud in particular. Would you agree that there has been sort of an ongoing rift, or do you think that this is something that's just occurred more recently?
I think there's clearly been I'm not sure I would call it a rift, but maybe more of a divergence in ideological focus, maybe in strategic views about how best to advance causes that predated Trump and then kind of went into the early Trump years, all of which I think has been severely exacerbated by the Trump era and the way various people viewed it, understood it, and reacted to it. So the only reason why I involve myself at all in this conflict, I generally avoid YouTube conflicts. In fact, I generally try to avoid insinuating myself into other people's feuds because I have enough of my own. Generally, I'm not looking to add to my list. Was because I did find it illustrative of important, broader trends that I think are taking place in center-left politics. And the two that called my attention in particular for that particular war, which it really has become, was the fact that, number one, it began by Cenk simply fabricating out of thin air the claim that Aaron Mate works for, where he's paid by the Russians. That was his exact quote, he's paid by the Russians. And I just found that notable because of how commonplace this has become to accuse people of being paid Kremlin agents or working for the Russians without the slightest basis. And it's not just YouTube personalities, but major Democratic Party and corporate media figures who do it all the time to me and others. So I wanted to comment on that part of it. And then also what I found to be the very disturbing weaponization of sexual harassment allegations that Anna Kasparian clearly launched against Jimmy in her own words as retaliation or punishment for the criticisms he had been voicing about her and about the Young Turks. So I agree with you that it didn't just come out of nowhere, that it's kind of part of this broader ideological division. And I think in general, there's two components to it, this kind of rift as you described it. One is the question of how you understood Donald Trump, the Trump movement, and the Trump era, whether you saw it as this radical, unprecedented deviation or aberration from the American political tradition, this kind of extremely alarming, never before seen fascist threat to American democracy, in which case, if you saw it that way, and I didn't, but I think that group that you identified did, then a whole variety of responses and positions and views follow from that quite naturally. We should censor the internet to prevent this fascist movement. We should align with anybody who's opposed to it, including the Democratic Party and neocons, because it's an existential threat and nothing should impede our ability to work with others to stop it. It's kind of like after 9/11, people who saw Islamic radicalism as an existential threat ended up almost rationally advocating things that before that they would have found unthinkable, because when there's an existential threat, you resort to things that otherwise you wouldn't. So I think that camp very much viewed Trump as this kind of extreme departure from, and actually the primary cause of, American pathologies, whereas the other group that includes me saw him very much as like a kind of continuation of the American political tradition, very reflective of the norms and practices that had come before it. The only real difference was how he spoke about it. He spoke about it kind of more candidly. He reflected the reality of American power. And I never thought that the United States, the most powerful paramilitarized country in the world that has a deep state, kind of a power center that exists independent of democratic elections, the only purpose of which is to prevent radical change and to preserve status quo power, ever got near anything like, I don't know, like a fascist coup or anything like that. So I always found Trump to be, at best, a very kind of like weak and lazy and ineffectual figure. Not even close to this, kind of grave threat. So I think there was a huge difference in how we understood Trump, and then also as a subsidiary to that, Russiagate, whether Russiagate was really this treasonous collusion between Trump and a foreign power, or whether it was just the ordinary thing that great powers do to one another to screw with each other, and that it was exploited by the CIA to undermine Trump, as I saw it. So that's number one, is genuine differences in how those things are understood. And then number two is I think there's also a difference in focus. There are people on the left who I don't think care very much about imperialism and militarism. If you ask them and they're forced to talk about it, they'll say, yeah, I'm against endless war. But on their list of priorities, they don't really think the CIA or the NSA are particularly significant evils. I don't think they think that American imperialism and the U.S. role as an empire in the world is of concern as much as, say, fixing the healthcare system or implementing incremental reforms and retirement benefits and the like. And so if you prioritize things like imperialism, where the Democratic and Republican parties have much more in common than they do differences, and where parts of the Republican Party are actually better on those issues than the mainstream Democratic Party, your view about how close you should be to the Democratic Party is going to be very different than if you care mostly about healthcare reform or kind of culture war issues, where the left's views tend to be more similar to Democrats. And so I think that accounts for a big part of the rift as well.
What I have also noticed is that these two factions seem to be congealing a bit more, where, again, there seems to be relationships between groups like TYT with, the Gravel teens who misrepresented Mike Gravel repeatedly, specifically regarding his endorsement of Tulsi Gabbard, and also on the issue of Syria.
And so I agree totally to pull the American troops out. It is not a loss of support of Kurds. The Kurds participated in the war in that area because of their own self-interest. We should have never been there to begin with. This is a regional problem that should be addressed by the regional players. We are not a regional player in that part of the world.
So I wanted to get your thoughts on this quote. This quote says, "There is no higher disgrace to America than the abandonment of the Kurds, fighters for freedom and independence, to the hard right forces of Erdogan. Every American should hang their head in shame." What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think we should hang our head in shame. I think we should hold our head high and bring home the American troops who have no business being there, period.
Do you know who said that quote?
Pardon me?
Do you know who said that quote?
No, who?
That was your Twitter account.
My Twitter account. Okay, well, that just goes to prove that sometimes the kids that ran my campaign don't always have the same views that I have or haven't listened to me. And so it's unfortunate that it's a quote that appears to come from me, but it doesn't come from me in this regard.
And also, with the Green Party as well. I don't know if you followed what happened with the rigging of the Green Party nomination in 2020. And then we also just see sort of like these policy issues turning into kind of personality things. So Vosh, for example, has been very outspoken against you and Jimmy Dore. And while he's also siding with TYT, I guess, on this issue of Syria, for example. So do you think that it's a fact that, again, there's not just this rift taking place, but that these two camps are really congealing into two factions?
Maybe. I think that YouTube in particular is most conducive to fostering feuds and personality-driven conflicts because the algorithms seem to reward that sort of thing. I noticed, just the YouTube video I made where I did comment on the conflict between Jimmy Dore and Aaron Mate on the one hand and the Young Turks on the other was one of my most watched. I barely use my YouTube page, but occasionally I'll put a video there, and that happened to be the most watched one. It got a lot of algorithmic references. And I do notice that there does seem to be a lot of kind of intra-community commentary among YouTubers, more so than, say, people who use, the written form or social media as their primary means of journalistic and political expression. So I think part of it is that, someone like Vosh, I know he's talked about me before. I know who he is. I've mentioned him when I've seen him do things before, but I know very little about him. I've never watched a video clip of his. So I think if you, kind of like exist in the world of YouTube, there are a lot of people who seem like they kind of drive the conversation, whereas they have almost no presence outside of YouTube. And he, is a person that I would put into that category. Then there are like breakthrough people who do start having greater influence. Kyle Kulinski and Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty obviously have, and I think Jimmy Dore has managed to kind of break out of that, where he has profiles written about him and them, in major magazines. But I don't think it's so much personality driven, because I don't think, say, Cenk Uyghur's personality is wildly different than Jimmy Dore's or Kyle Kulinski. I don't think it's so much personality. I think it's a genuine divergence of how to do politics and ideology. I think that camp, kind of the Majority Report and Sam Cedar and those kind of people, they'll criticize the Democratic Party, but at the end of their day, their politics is inextricably linked to the Democratic Party. And if yours isn't, they regard you as less of an ally than, say, Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, because those are the people who they're in bed with. So I think the differences are more substantive than personality driven.
So another issue that has emerged during this TYT feud is the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg and others invested $20 million into TYT several years ago. And Jimmy Dore has brought this up a couple of times, suggesting that TYT's opinions have changed on a couple issues. In fact, when he was on this show, he actually brought up the fact that there was discussion about TYT changing their positions while he was still there.
So, and then it was like a year later that executive at the TYT told me that they have to move towards the center. And so I didn't know.
Can you just share any more details about that specifically? Like, what was that conversation like, and just how was that framed exactly?
I was saying the same shit. I'm like, well, if he's taking money from these people, how is it not going to affect it? It's obviously going to affect, right? And he goes, well, we have to move towards the center. We know that. That's a direct quote. So, and I don't want to say who that was, Ben Mankiewicz was one of my best friends over there. I had a lot of good friends. I don't want to say who said it. But that was said. And then and when I saw them smear Julian Assange, I was like, oh, they're doing this. They're signaling to a donor. You could tell Cenk didn't even believe what he was saying, just like they don't believe what they're saying about Aaron Mate, just like they don't believe what they're saying about me, just like they don't believe what they're saying about Syria. You could tell in their face, they don't believe it. And he didn't believe. Cenk was just like, oh, I have to do this because he's signaling to a donor.
And I think that we saw this most pronounced recently in June when Anna Kasparian started mentioning that she is in favor of anti-camping laws.
I do think that there are progressives, I don't know if it's progressive policy, but progressives in places like California who have made terrible decisions. And so one of those terrible decisions is essentially doing away with anti-camping laws, right? Allowing people to camp out wherever they want, whenever they want. And if, like, we have a homeless problem in California, we have it all throughout the country, but it's particularly bad in California. And so the argument is, well, if there isn't public housing available for people, they should be allowed to camp out. Okay, but there's also a problem right now where there is public housing available and individuals will say, no, I don't want to take it. I don't want to follow the rules in the public housing. And so as a result, I would rather camp out. Progressive lawmakers are like, we should allow them to camp out. And you know what happens? Crime happens. Open air drug markets happen, and it's the truth. These are the facts of the matter. In fact, it was addressed in this Daily Beast article, and honestly, it was cathartic to read it because everyone denies that this is happening.
And this was happening as Jeffrey Katzenberg was lobbying to criminalize homelessness. So just based on that alone, it appears as though there must be some tangential sort of influence on TYT's talking points, at least for the fact that they didn't bring anyone on with an alternative perspective to speak against that, or they haven't directly mentioned the recent criminalization of homelessness. So I'm just wondering what your take is on that overall. Do you think that that $20 million has influenced TYT, or do you think that they would espouse many of the same views regardless?
You know, honestly, I don't know Cenk and Anna well enough, especially these days, to be able to say with any degree of confidence what their motivations are about why they do particular things or take certain positions. So let me just talk generally about this question, about how whether people are motivated to think differently or advocate differently in order to appease or accommodate those on whom they're financially dependent, their funders. I think it's very difficult in general to know other people's motives. And I also think it's a rare person who consciously decides that they're going to advocate things they don't really believe because they know that their funder wants them to. Like, that level of ethical corruption, when expressed that explicitly, is so deep that you almost have to be a sociopath or someone with absolutely zero personal dignity to admit to yourself that you're actually doing that, right? To like do that consciously. Like, I actually have empathy for the homeless, but because I know we got $20 million from Jeffrey Katzenberg and I want maybe another round of investment from him, and I know that the anti-homeless crusade is important, I'm going to go and artificially or falsely pretend that I share that view with him in order to get more money. Like, that kind of conscious, explicit corruption, I think, is not common for people. I think what happens is more subtle than that, and I think it happens in one of two ways. And this is actually something that Noam Chomsky has talked a lot about, I think probably in the best way, which is, you know, he's long had a theory that the people who fund media, corporate media, like advertisers and corporations, dictate the content of that media because they're not going to fund media that's contrary to their interest. And when he says that, people who work, you know, employees of media corporations will say, that's absolutely crazy. I can tell you, you know, no one has ever told me what to say. No one has ever come to me and said, hey, I want you to advocate for that war. I want you to, you know, take this position in line with these corporate interests. So you're wrong. That doesn't happen. What you're claiming doesn't happen. Funders don't come to you and tell you what to say. Managers don't either. And his answer is, I know that. I'm not suggesting that they do. I'm not saying, and I guess, like, to use the Katzenberg Young Turks example, since that's the one you asked me about, he would say, I'm not saying that Jeffrey Katzenberg picks up the phone and calls Anna Kasparian and tells her what to say. He doesn't need to do that because, number one, she knows what he wants her to say, right? He doesn't need to tell her, hey, don't stray too far away from Democratic Party politics since I'm a big DNC funder and I believe in the Democratic Party. She knows that he thinks that. And so subliminally or subconsciously, when Cenk and Anna know that they're now being funded by somebody who views the Democratic Party as a really important instrument, subliminally they're going to know that there's limits on what they can say without offending him. But I think the more important dynamic that Chomsky describes is when journalists say to him, no one has ever told me what to say. He'll say to them, look, and there's a famous, I think it was the BBC or the CBC, I don't remember which, but there was a famous interview where a journalist challenged him and said, no one ever tells me what to say. And he said, oh, I don't think that you're being inauthentic at all. I don't think you're saying these things because you don't believe them. What I'm telling you is that if you didn't believe them, you wouldn't be sitting in that seat. Meaning the BBC and the CBC will only hire people who work within a certain narrow range of opinions, and anyone who's a dissident from those orthodoxies would never get a job hosting a CBC or an NBC or an MSNBC or a BBC show. And I think that's, the case for the Young Turks. It's not that the Young Turks changed because Jeffrey Katzenberg invested $20 million in them. I think it's more the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg chose the Young Turks to invest $20 million in shows you what the Young Turks are, which is a very non-threatening and mainstream voice that's slightly to the left of the center of the Democratic Party, which you absolutely need if you're a believer in Democratic Party power, because it's the AOCs and the Bernie Sanders of the world who convince leftists who are to the left of, say, Nancy Pelosi, that the Democratic Party is still their home. That's what keeps them captive to the Democratic Party is, oh, look, I see Bernie Sanders and AOC there. That's who I identify with. And they're in the Democratic Party, so that's my party. And I think that I don't think it's that the Young Turks once was this radical, subversive platform that became more mainstream once Jeffrey Katzenberg invested in them. I think Jeffrey Katzenberg invested in them because they were never that. They were always, ultimately, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, when the rubber meets the road, tools of the Democratic Party. And maybe they've become more of that because, like I said, the Trump era drove the left into the arms even more than they ever were before the Democratic Party in unity against what they believe was this fascist threat. But I think the Young Turks are pretty much what they've always been.
Thank you, everyone, for taking this retrospective trip with me back through memory lane, going through all of these different interviews with all of these different figures. Again, I'd love to know if you are interested in having non-political interviews on this channel, or if you would like them somewhere else. Please do let me know in the comments below. Also, remember that I do need your help to keep this show going. Please do subscribe. Also, like the Primo Radical Facebook page. Follow Primo Radical on Twitter and Instagram. And also subscribe to Primo Radical on Telegram. Also, do sign up for the Primo Radical mailing list at primoradical.com. This is in case if I ever do get completely deplatformed, I can still reach you via email. So please do go to primoradical.com and sign up for the mailing list. Finally, please go to patreon.com/primoradical and become a patron for only $1 a month. For that $1, not only will you keep this show going, you will also get access to all of my guests and be able to submit questions directly to them. Thanks again, folks. Thanks for listening. And until next time, stay radical.